meet on Tuesdays. But it seemed not the best idea to have multiple weeks off when we just got started. So that's why we record things, and that's why we have Zoom. So we'll just sort of do our best. If I remember correctly, we left off in the 6th century or the 600s with our kind of breeze tour of Christian history. Does that sound right?
Yes.
I did want to make sure I paused for a second and said, going back a little bit, that there's a couple other resources that are around that a lot of folks outside of the Roman Catholic Church tend to not know of or read. And that is that there are these people called the early church fathers. And I'm sorry that there aren't early church mothers who have like long writings, but there just aren't. So there's these early church fathers. They're also called like the patristics. And these are people like Irenaeus of Lyon, an early bishop, writing obviously in Lyon in France, who they all wrote sort of a variety of letters that are kind of historical Christian documents. And these sort of people are in the canon of saints. So if you're looking at the Roman Catholic saints calendar, or frankly, the Episcopal saints calendar, you'll find some of these people up there because they've helped form and shape the tradition for what it is we do and how we do it. There's a book attributed to no particular person called the Didache, which is a sort of direction on how you're supposed to do pastoral services, and the Apostles' Creed shows it up in it. And the Didache says things like, hey, when you baptize somebody, it should be in living water, which means running water or water that came from the sky, like not in a basin. Use the basin if there's no other alternative. It sort of ranks through how you should consider things like that. And so the Didache is an old document. It didn't make it into the Bible, but it has always kind of been alongside the Bible, just kind of like the Apocrypha has for what that's worth. So there are resources by folks that are out there, and some of them were famous and influential, and then like weren't. Like Origen of Alexandria was this incredibly brilliant thinker. There was a persecution going on in Alexandria, and he was like running out in the street to get martyred, and his mom was like, no thank you, and pulled him back by his shirt and made him stay at home. And he wrote voluminously. I mean, he was like the Thomas Aquinas of his own era, like pages and pages and pages, until people decided he was a heretic. But a lot of his thinking was really quite clever and interesting. And unfortunately, when you decide someone's a heretic, you kind of decide not to read any of their works, even though most of his work is not controversial. So there's a few folk like that. I just wanted to mention. Tertullian's another one of them, who you may or may not have heard of. Tertullian was writing in North Africa before Augustine, and initially was very influential, and then people decided he was a heretic too. So this kind of has happened throughout time, even early on. I think I mentioned to you that after the Nicene Creed, a number of people went out to the desert, and not all of them were heretics. Some people decided that they would go to the desert and just sort of live by themselves in isolation, and that's where some of the first monasteries came from. And some of them you maybe have heard of, like St. Anthony, who heard the passage, sell all you have, come follow me. And Anthony literally did that. He sold everything, and for some time, like, he lived on a pillar. And I guess people fed him and gave him water, but it turns out people considered him to be extremely wise. And so royalty would go out in the desert to seek his counsel. So these are folks, like famous, mostly men, although there's women that start to show up as well. So these are writings that you can read, like the life of St. Anthony actually really inspired Francis, who we will probably get to today, to sell everything. I mean, that's something Francis did as well. I did want to tell you one other thing about Augustine too. I think I mentioned to you last week that Augustine was a Platonist. He believed that the body was really bad and that the spirit was really good. And Augustine was also, it turns out, very anti-Christian, even though his mother was Christian, until he met this guy called Saint Ambrose of Milan, who was a bishop, who told him that the Bible is supposed to be interpreted allegorically. So not literally, but allegorically. And Augustine, being a rhetorician, that's what he did as his occupation. He was a tutor and an instructor, found that very lovely and charming. And so that influenced, frankly, the way Augustine read scripture and offered us ideas like original sin. He didn't do a surface level reading. He said, detail A is a cipher for reality A. So everything was this thinly veiled allegory, which he found really interesting and helpful and creative. So I'm going backward a little bit just to say that people take like this course in like 3 years, and we're not going to give it that kind of justice, right? But just it occurs to me I've missed a few things. Okay, so we talked about St. Patrick for a second. We talked about how the Irish saved civilization, and now that brings us up to the 600s. And I know this isn't exactly this course. It'll be the next one that we do. There is a really important thing that happens in the year 622, which is that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, flees from Mecca to this place called, initially it's called Medina, and that's called the Hijra, and that's the beginning of the Muslim calendar. So the first 10 years, Islam doesn't do a whole lot, but it starts to gain in popularity, and all of a sudden, the Muslims come back and they conquer is not the right word, but they take Mecca, and then they really rapidly spread, not just through Saudi Arabia, but all of a sudden through Northern Africa and into what we now call Iran, which was Zoroastrian territory. And they make it so far and so fast that by the year 700, they're up in Spain, right? And this is where the Moors come from. These are essentially people of African and Arab mixed lineage that have now penetrated into Spain. And it really draws to a head in the 800s because the Islamic Empire is religiously very coherent, and they sort of make this claim that really everybody is meant to be united under the banner of heaven. And people find the Islamic faith and message very compelling, actually. So compelling that they're willing to fight and die for it. And so the Islamic Empire starts to get into France. It's winning left and right, and you probably are aware that the Islamic Empire took all of Spain with it, right? So it wasn't until the Battle of Tours, which is in France, that what we know of as Western Europe, not counting Spain, stopped the advance of the Islamic Empire. So this is a major challenge to sort of the Christian West. That happened, maybe you know him, Charles Martel was sort of the general and the hero of the Battle of Tours. There's a legend that Charles Martel had a magic sword, and this is how he won. And what do you know? The sword disappeared after he died, but it showed up again later. Does anybody know who found the magic sword of Charles Martel?
Charlemagne?
It wasn't Charlemagne nor Arthur, although those are good ideas. It would have fit either. It's Joan of Arc. She finds the magic sword of Charles Martel. She believed it to be such. It was buried under an altar, and that's what she uses to help the Dauphin become, well, the king of France, and to help the French not win the 100 Years' War, but not lose it, because they were going to lose. So anyway, that's looking way forward to Joan, but this halting of the Islamic empire under Charles Martel also played into Charlemagne becoming the first Holy Roman Emperor, right? And so, as I'd mentioned to you, I think when the Nicene Creed was written, it was just sort of a document. It wasn't used in liturgy, but that changed under Charlemagne, also called Karl. In German, he's called Karl. This is really interesting because German doesn't have a word for Charles. So Karl der Grosse, who was coronated the Holy Roman Emperor in this city called Aachen, which used to be rather influential, it's not anymore, was really the first person since the Visigoths and the Vandals sacked Rome and carved up the Roman Empire into this kind of nomadic hordes to have then an empire. And he united it under the Nicene Creed, which is how it became the Holy Roman Empire, and he was crowned by the Pope in Aachen. So this is really the first time in 400 years that there's been this political, I mean, Roman really has to be in quotes because Roman technology had been lost and squandered, as many of you know. That we sometimes call this the Dark Ages. That's not really fair, but a lot of the writings and libraries had been burned and lost, and frankly, people forgotten how to make aqueducts, right? And so this was a time of Roman Empire, like we could call it 2.0, but we could really call it 0.5, right? Because it was still trying to like grab its feet. So
Charlemagne?
Charlemagne is at the end of the end of the 700s into the 800s. So he is concurrent with Charles Martel. When he becomes the king, this is an interesting dichotomy that starts to happen that really becomes important during the Reformation. You have the emperor, and then you have the pope. And who's more important? Now, that's an ongoing conversation, because at this time, there are these things called the papal estates, and the pope actually owns quite a bit of land in Italy. Owns or overseas. I'm not sure that there's a difference because the Pope is directly receiving the income from the papal states. That changes during the Reformation when the Pope's lands get taken from him. But for a long, like by military force. But for about 600 years, the Pope is sitting on not just sort of income and spiritual authority, but also quite a bit of secular money and secular authority from lands that he directly overseas. And so there is this kind of, in some ways, awkward co-rulership going on between Charlemagne, the first one, and the Pope. Charlemagne does an interesting liturgical move. So you would think the Pope is the spiritual move, but as I mentioned, Charlemagne is the one who introduces the Nicene Creed to the Mass. And he does it because when he conquers these former tribes and areas that are from the Gauls and the Vandals and the Visigoths, they're all heretics. They're like Christian in name, but they believe Jesus was a created being subordinate to the Father. So the Nicene Creed is not initially a thing of like, hey, we're supporting each other, we're in this together. It is, you're going to confess the right doctrine or you're not welcome to receive the Eucharist. And at that time, when you don't receive the Eucharist, well, you go to hell when you die. So this becomes like a forced doctrine on people who kind of have to do it, or they're spiritually in jeopardy, and beyond that, they've just been physically conquered. So they don't really have a lot of options here. And so this is how the creed comes into the service.
Interesting thing I read about Charlemagne. He had a bunch of children, and it is said that just about everyone in Europe who is Asian has some DNA from
Charlemagne.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just like George Washington was the father of this nation, right? That's apparently George Washington knew many women other than Martha as well, right? So anyway. Okay, so things kind of stabilize in Europe, albeit like we're still at a time where literacy is an all-time low. I mean, how did people live? I mean, life was pretty dirty. I mean, you were just pretty dirty and you smelled bad, and your only lights were from things like candles, right? And Europe is really cold. So this is just sort of a tough time. The Islamic advance halted under Charles Martel, but There was also some kind of foundering, there was some rivalries that also halted that advance. And there's this just kind of this period, I want to say, of quiet, but what really starts to happen is relative stability until we get a couple of thinkers who show up, and those are the ones I wanted to highlight today. So one of the earlier thinkers writing in the 9th century is somebody you may not know by name, but you probably know by idea. And he's writing in England. And Anselm of Canterbury is an attorney. I mean, at the time, if you went to any kind of formal training, there were two disciplines, the priesthood and the law. And law was supposed to be based on canon law anyway, right? So Anselm's writing in the 10th century, that's the 900s, and he's trying to figure out, like, what does it mean, this whole Christian message? And he comes up with this idea, again, being a lawyer, that God is really, really just. And God is so just that God's justice has to be perfect, which means when somebody commits a crime, there has to be remuneration or penance, but it has to be perfect penance. And since God, being perfect, is wronged by any human sin, there has to be perfect satisfaction, but humans are too imperfect to make the satisfaction. So Anselm's idea is that the only person who could make perfect satisfaction would be somebody perfect. That's Jesus. And Anselm decides that just like when you commit a capital crime like treason, the punishment has to be death, that God must be like that. So God's perfect justice requires perfect satisfaction, which requires the death of somebody. And this is where the idea of substitutionary atonement comes from. That is, Jesus takes our place because he's perfect and we're not. We've sinned, he didn't. Somebody's going to pay the sin price, which is the treason price, which is death. So, again, this is called, initially it's called substitution. The word penal substitution gets applied later, but this is Anselm's idea of, like, what does the life and death of Jesus, like, do? What does it mean? I mentioned Irenaeus of Lyon, and he's much earlier, but Irenaeus was one, and you find this also in the New Testament writings, who have this different idea of ransom. The idea that, like, we've been taken captive by sin and Jesus came to pay the ransom. Now, that's like one of the earlier ideas. There's no devil in that idea. That idea comes later. The idea that the devil has us hostage and is dragging us down to hell has spawned a number of kind of folk tales and mythology. But that wasn't Irenaeus's idea. His idea was that we're kind of enslaved by our own social and poor choices. A lot of psychologists would agree with that. And so who pays the ransom? Well, God will ransom us from our own choices. I mean, that actually seems relatively lovely until you start putting the red guy in the pitchfork, and how did he get that powerful anyway? No one seems to know. But most people had been living with the ransom idea, or this other idea called recapitulation, which you also find the seeds of in the New Testament, which is, hey, Adam made a bad choice. We're all suffering in bad choices. So if one guy could set in motion a lot of bad things, another good guy could set in motion a lot of good things. So Jesus is like the new Adam. We don't have to live in a way that takes us to death. We can live in a way that leads to life. That's the summary. If you start to do like Augustine, you say, well, that bad thing is genetic and that's original sin. But that's a warp of what the original idea. The original idea is, hey, we're not doomed to make bad choices. Like, we got another guy. And that, the one I'm giving you there, like, hey, we've got another chance, is this other guy called Peter Abelard. He's a contemporary with Anselm, and he says that Jesus is our moral leader. So what's the point of Jesus? He didn't show us we need to die for God. He came to show us how to truly live. That's his understanding of recapitulation. So if you want to know, like, what was the mission of Jesus, it was to show us a way to live that's unencumbered, what it means to love our neighbor as ourselves, etc. So really, that's just a spin on recapitulation. And these are sort of the dominant schools of thought. Peter Abelard was really interesting because he, you can hear this is like, in some ways you say, like, how, that's very progressive and liberal thinking. It's 1,000 years old, right? And this has not fully taken hold of the European imagination or tradition. I mean, this is also a new idea. These guys are just trying to figure out theologically what's this stuff mean. What's interesting to know is that most Christian traditions in this country buy this lock, stock, and barrel. But this is not an original idea, nor was it the only idea. So what we think of, sometimes we hear this and we say, Anselm, he's the traditional one. He wasn't when he was writing, and neither was he the non-traditional one. I mean, these were just ideas. Abelard fell in love with this lady called Eloise, but Abelard was not an important. Do you know this story? It's a sad story. Eloise loved him back, and I think they secretly got married and consummated the relationship. But Eloise's uncle didn't think much of Abelard because he wasn't wealthy, and Eloise, was like a duchess. So he sent some goons in the night, and Abelard found himself gelded all of a sudden. And yeah, that's not great. So he went to a monastery, which is kind of what you do. And she went to a convent. I mean, that was it. And they had this really interesting letters back and forth, because apparently they actually did really love each other for who they were. And these letters become the foundation in some ways, or the inspiration for something called courtly love, which you maybe have heard of before. So marriages in general are arranged. They have a lot to do with titles. And then now there's this other bit like, hey, these aren't just chattel investments. Like there's courtly love and there's romance. And a lot of this comes from the letters that Abelard and Eloise write to one another. So here's a couple of ideas. Then there's this spot. Turns out Eloise is from this really nice portion of France called the Languedoc, which is like extremely resource rich. They make fine wines. And in that area, within 100 years of Eloise, there's this problem. There's these people that they get two different names, and I don't know why. They're called the Cathars or the Cathars, but they're also called the Albigensians. And they get identified as heretics because they don't think that clergy have to be celibate, and nor do they think that clergy are more important than lay folk, which puts them a little bit at odds with the Pope's authority to order political and religious business. Now, there's a couple other things they do, but they're not communists, but they're kind of communalists. And the Pope decides that these are bad folks and that they need to be converted. And if they're not willing to be converted to the true faith, then they can die. Thank you very much. So this is the first Inquisition. Spain is the second Inquisition. The first Inquisition is to the Albigensians, and it's done by the Dominicans. They're given this task. And it is the case that the Dominicans wipe out the Cathars. Like, people convert or they die, and a lot of them die. And it's Dominican priests that do that.
Around 1100.
Yeah, around 1100. And there's a second thing happening right around there that we're going to get to as well. This is in Europe. This is in France. This is in wealthy, nice France. The Cathars and the Albigensians are not militants. They've like read the Bible and this makes sense to them, and now they're being killed. Yeah.
Well, I was raised Catholic, so I've never heard of this, or I don't know about this. And I don't understand exactly where the Catholic Church fits into this. What side of
The
this?
Pope orders it. The Pope orders the Inquisition against the Albigensians. Yeah.
And we've spent time in the land of.
Languedoc, yeah. It's beautiful, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely wonderful. Yeah.
Wonderful area. Wonderful area.
Actually, like if you read the Albigensian heresy, you're like, that seems pretty reasonable. It just didn't at the time. This is one thing. And it's also happening around the same time. You probably know in 1051, there is this caliph in Jerusalem, Islamic, who is ruling the city. And he gets a little out of sorts. Like people probably would diagnose him with something like bipolar or borderline personality disorder, because he does this unprecedented thing by burning down the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So the whole Church of the Holy Sepulchre was one identified by Constantine's own mother. Constantine's mother went to the Holy Land and identified pilgrimage sites and like artifacts that we would maybe call relics as well that belong to saints. And she identified this place in Jerusalem that we call the Episcopal, the tomb of Jesus. And Constantine gave money to build a church over that. So it was a series of caves and graves. And what Constantine did is leveled all the ones around it, like brought them down to bedrock and just left the tomb of Jesus. So it wasn't ever like a tomb. They quarried all the other ones so that people could go into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and circumambulate the tomb, walk around it. By the way, might be where Muslims got the idea to circumambulate Mecca, because none of us are that original. We copy off each other. Anyway, so they built this church over that Episcopal, which had been there for 700 years. And even though the Islamic Empire swallowed up Jerusalem rather quickly, pilgrims had always been welcome there. Muslims, Christians, Jews lived in very much in peace in Jerusalem, provided that Christians and Jews paid like a tax that was levied on them for not being Muslim. We'll learn more about that when we study Islam. But you were tolerated if you paid the tax, and they did. But this particular caliph burned this building down, was immediately removed. The Islamic Empire started rebuilding the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, started doing this, and the Pope got a great idea. There's a lot of people in Europe, like too many. So what we should do is send them to retake the Holy Land, and then we wouldn't have this population problem, and like they wouldn't burn our church down again. And that, of course, is called the First Crusade. So 1051, the First Crusade is launched, and there are some really popular theological people who are in favor of this, like Bernard of Clairvaux, who is a Christian mystic, and his writings are fantastic. We talked about this Sunday briefly. He wrote volumes of sermons based on the Song of Songs, which is an erotic love poem between two folk, but he very much made it a mystical allegory between God and humanity, or God and the believer. And you can read like 100 pages on the first verse, which is, he kissed me with the kiss of his mouth, in which Bernard mystically talks about this is God's tender relationship with human beings, that it is God kissing us, and what that means. So he was very powerful and influential because he was a holy man. I mean, people considered him a holy man. And Bernard spoke in favor of the First Crusade. And so many of you know, like, Christian knights marched down to the Holy Land. And sort of it makes sense, if you're going to fight the infidel in a different land, maybe you're also going to fight the infidel in your own land. And this is also the beginning of some very strong pogroms, especially in places like Speyer in Germany. Again, Jews had not been like respected, but they'd been tolerated in communities like Speyer. But as people are coming down from the north, from France and Germany, they have this idea, well, look, if we're going to go fight Muslims because they're theologically wrong, well, what's stopping us from fighting Jews on our own territory? And so these are pretty horrific. Like if you were a Jew in Speyer, it didn't go well for you. And a lot of it amounted to looting, as we know, looting. On the way to these boats that took them to Constantinople, which then took them to the Holy Land, where initially the First Crusade was pretty successful in the sense that they did take Antioch and Jerusalem and large swaths of Syria and modern day Lebanon, and there they built Crusader castles, right? Which you can still view today. Some of them are still standing and standing pretty well. The Kingdom of Heaven, which is a movie starring Orlando Bloom and Edward Norton, interesting film, is written around, when the Christian advances started to fail, because they did. You may know that people were told that if they go on this crusade to motivate them, that all of their sins would be absolved. So this is like really attractive. If you are like a petty noble and not a high noble, you can go and get land and titles, and even better, like you'll be absolved. And you probably do know this phrase, kill them all, let God sort them out. You probably heard that. It is a phrase from the First Crusade. When invading Jerusalem, the Crusaders said, there's all these people in the city, we don't know if they're Christians or Jews or Muslims. And the reply was, kill them all, God will know God's own. So that's a real phrase from the First Crusade, and theoretically the streets of Jerusalem were red with blood, and I mean very, very red with blood from the First Crusade. This actually really sparks the problem of Middle Eastern Christian, Jewish, Muslim relationships, was the First Crusade. This is unprecedented, anything like this. The Islamic Empire invasion of Europe, this is a different thing from going to the Holy City and committing wholesale slaughter. Islamic Empire invasion is an army versus an army, not an army versus women and children and old people and animals and civilians. So the Crusaders invent this, for what it's worth. A very, very dark part of our history. You probably know that the Crusader success is very fleeting. The Islamic Empire was frankly huge and based in this area, unlike Europeans who were not based in this area, and very divided. I mean, French and German people weren't really under a common language. I mean, I guess you could say Latin, but they weren't. And they weren't under a common goal. I mean, frankly, they were jockeying to get power for themselves, to become lords in this new kingdom, not to be united. So the Crusades, they're even though they're initially successful, frankly, because the Muslim Empire was like very surprised that this happened, that somebody would do this, it doesn't work really well. You probably know that there's 4 Crusades, and the other 3 really go very poorly. One is called the Children's Crusades, where like there's this idea from friars that, hey, if children just walked to the Holy Land, being God's chosen people, it would all just turn out fine. And it doesn't. Like they end up starving and becoming enslaved and becoming, frankly, like sex slaves who are trafficked. Many of them don't make it to the Holy Land at all. And like this actually happened, like thousands of children were trying to go from Europe to Israel following a Pied Piper. The Third Crusade you probably know about. This is where these famous people like Richard the Lionheart and Friedrich Barbarossa, maybe you've heard of. Do you know Barbarossa, the German king, red-haired? Curiously enough, when the Nazis decide to invade Russia, it's called Operation Barbarossa.
That's where I go down.
which was about as successful as the real Friedrich Barbarossa, who accomplished nothing. Actually, he like went to take a bath and died on the way. So he didn't even fight in a battle. It's like wasn't very good. On the way, the Third and the Fourth Crusade, they're on their way to Jerusalem. They get to Constantinople, and Constantinople's like, hey, we're not putting you guys up for months, right? Like, we're just trying to survive and take care of ourselves. So the Crusaders sack Constantinople, which is like their own city. So Crusader behavior is pretty much mob rule, just to be really clear. And by the year like 1230, the Crusades are gone. Everything is in Muslim control, whether that's Antioch or Jerusalem, etc. So this ugly chapter of about 200 years, the intensity is in the first 50, is over by the mid 1200s.
It's awful.
It's pretty awful. And again, you're hearing, right, that there's in some ways, there's this crusade to the Holy Land, and then there's the crusades within the Holy Roman Empire itself. The Albigensian heresy, or the Cathars, and also pogroms against Jews, right? So this is really, really tough.
You know, it's interesting to me, just personally, growing up in a Catholic school and learning a lot of some of this, but it wasn't taught from that perspective of church doing such bad things. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, and I don't know that anybody's trying to go gild it. We just have to be honest. Like,
No, yeah, I understand.
this was the Pope's idea.
Yeah, no.
And I say, like, oh, maybe it was addressing overpopulation. I mean, this is us looking back. But I mean, overpopulation was a problem. There weren't enough jobs, and apparently there weren't enough resources because farming techniques were like very primitive. So it did solve that. And look, you did take the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. I mean, never mind that you were also rebuilding it because you also thought that was nuts, right? Like there's just a lot on the table. This is also a time where, and this has been happening for a bit, where political and religious rule is a little bit weird, right? So maybe you've heard of simony. Simony is like when you buy a bishopric. Like you pay money and you become a bishop. And that's happening in the Holy Roman Empire for a couple of reasons, right? Hey, it's always great when you have a fundraiser. Why do you need funds? Because you're like fighting wars, and that's expensive and costly, right? And you're sending farmers to go and fight wars, so you don't have as much labor, right? So you need money. So simony. Reminder, in the ancient world, or not too ancient world, if you're a king, your first son is your heir, which means all of your other children are like not your heir because you can only have one. So what do you do with your other boys? Well, if they can't be politically powerful, then you get them to be religiously powerful because the Pope and Charlemagne have these kind of parallel domains. So the first son becomes the heir, the second son becomes the bishop. And then the other sons, well, you got to figure out what to do with them, right? Often they become like, second?
Yeah.
To the military, where they can become the equivalent of like generals or gentry. Although keep in mind that sometimes kings, depending on the king, would lead the soldiers onto the field. Richard Lionheart being one of them, Barbarossa being another, who would actually fight in their own wars. But your third ones would be your colonels.
Or attorneys.
Or say again.
Or attorneys.
Attorneys is usually a middle class job, not a. And judges are different, right? A judge, maybe your third son becomes a judge, right? But attorneys are more for the middle class, like the merchant class, which starts to grow during this time, right? There's this growth of you essentially have got serfs and peasants who don't own their own land, but they're not even sharecroppers, right? They're serfs. And then you've got landowners, but now you start to get some trade because you've got boats all of a sudden going to the Holy Land and going to the Silk Road, and they're bringing stuff back. And now there's these merchants who are becoming brokers. Now there's always been merchants, but as trade tends to accompany military conquest, right? And so this is starting to rise as partially as a result of the Crusades. Ship travel. Yeah, now you have a lot more boats, and you got somebody paying for the boats. That's the Pope. So simony becomes a problem. Another problem that's been going around for a while is illiterate clergy, because you needed more clergy than you could train, and education was expensive. I mean, 99% of people couldn't read. So who could? Cabinet advisors, maybe not even the monarch themselves, we don't know, but theoretically a monarch can read. And then your clergy are supposed to read because they're the only ones who can read the Bible. And the Bible costs so much money that there's not a lot of copies anyway, right? It takes somebody a year to copy the Bible by hand on vellum, because they don't have good paper, right? So you're using a veal skin to make a copy of the Bible. So that's enormously expensive. So it's not like any old person can even afford to have one. Churches are supposed to have one, but not all churches have one. That's actually one of the things Henry VIII does in England that says every church has to have a Bible. And what do you know they did with it? They chained it so that people couldn't steal it, because it was enormously valuable to have somebody's whole year. So that's not even to the 1500s that every church gets a Bible. So priests start to become illiterate, or there are plenty of illiterate priests, and they start to do things that are funny, like pretend they speak Latin when they don't. Because Latin was not the language of the masses. It was the language of the elite. The language of the masses was things like French and Swiss German, which I find really difficult to understand as a German speaker, right? I mean, they're like, it's localized dialects, right? And so what they would do is pretend, and nobody knew the difference. And I've told you this before, there's the words in the Mass that say, hoc est corpus meum, this is the body of Christ. And it's hard to know whether children heard that and they heard hocus pocus instead of hocus corpus, or the illiterate priest said, hocus pocus, because it could have been both equally. And hey, look, if those words can turn this bread into flesh, like they must be the magic words. So that's sort of how that came into effect. That's happening right now during the Crusades, that we're getting illiterate clergy, we're getting the practice of simony, we're getting bishops who are bishop of 3 areas, and they're called absentee bishops because they don't even go to their other areas. They just bought the title so they could reap the benefits, because when you're a bishop, you're able to get some of the revenues. The revenues go first to the abbey, and then they go on to the bishop, essentially, and then the bishop passes them up to Rome. But always skimming a little off the top or a lot off the top.
How far into the history of this do we begin to be more, what is the right word to use? Acceptable, or
Who's we?
we the Catholics, and are the people that were the church people that were running the
I don't know. I think church people are still struggling to be acceptable today. If you don't mind me saying, this part of this conflict happened when we got the Nicene Creed and the donation of Constantine, because that's when church and state became one. So all of a sudden, you don't just have spiritual authority, now you've got real political authority. But theoretically, the United States was founded with a separation of church and state. That's patently false. And that's also becoming more and more of a quagmire, because there's this thing called Christian nationalism, where we decide that America is the new promised land, and therefore what we do must be what God wants us to do. That's how we slaughtered all the Native Americans. It's called manifest destiny or Christian nationalism. It's also happening now, and it's an intentional strategy you can read about, where this group called the GOP has made a single issue for voting. It was a clever plan. It took Catholics and Protestants alike in the 1970s that we're going to make abortion the single most influential issue when we vote. So I'm not quite sure we've got it right yet.
It's kind of depressing.
Well, it's just honest.
Well, no,
It's just honest.
I'm not quarrel, I mean,
I mean, there's good Christian folk. Don't get me wrong. There's good Christian folk.
Yeah.
And good Christian folk like the rest of us make mistakes. I mean, Bernard of Clairvaux was like arguably a holy man. He supported the crusade probably for like good reasons without realizing, frankly, the terror he was unleashing.
Maybe I'm just reacting to the fact that I was raised as a very strict Catholic in a Catholic school.
Hey, Episcopalians have not always been on the right side either. I just want to be real clear. When we get to the 50s and 60s, boy, you'll really see that. But we weren't great throughout American history. We were powerful, but we weren't great.
You were talking about the Crusades. And the Crusades were going to Constantinople, but wasn't there a split there between the churches?
That split had already happened. Oh, I didn't talk about that yet. God, this is so good. Thanks, Tim. So 1051 is the crusade.
Okay.
And there's another thing that happens during the Crusades. It's important. It's called the Magna Carta, right? That happens when Richard the Lionheart's gone on a crusade, and the peasants like take him captive and say, "You're going to give us rights, or we're going to kill you." So he signs the Magna Carta under duress. Hey, good for the people of England, good for human rights everywhere, because it's giving serfs rights. And it isn't but 10 years after the First Crusade. 1062. 1062 is what's called the schism between East and West. It's not called the Great Schism, that's something else. The schism between East and West happens during the First Crusade, and it is when the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Pope in Rome, the Bishop of Rome, excommunicate one another. Boy, I really dropped the ball there. So there'd been tension for a bit. Reminder that Constantine moved the capital of the Roman Empire to Constantinople because that was geographically the center, although the Bishop of Rome had this position because of Peter and was like a spiritual heavyweight. But the Patriarch of Constantinople, being the center of the empire, was a spiritual heavyweight too. So the two understood, I got to work with you. And Rome was in disarray after being sacked and looted for a couple hundred years, right? So Constantinople's growing, it's getting more powerful. There's this whole Byzantine history where they build the biggest freestanding dome in the world for 1,000 years. That's the Hagia Sophia or the Hagia Sophia. That was in Constantinople. The walls of Constantinople were like basically impregnable. I mean, cannonballs just bounced off of them. It took Muslims a long time to take Constantinople. Like, it was really difficult to conquer the city. I mean, it was sort of the marvel of the world, like the New York City or probably the modern Dubai of the world. Like, that's had the best, brightest architecture. Meanwhile, Rome is just kind of this pathetic, sad place. But it does start to rebuild itself a bit under Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Empire, right? That's essentially the West. Meanwhile, the Byzantines are doing their thing in the East. So there's starts to become these parallel developments, and Rome starts to build back up slowly, starts to kind of build some new buildings, clear away the rubble. This is happening. And the power between these two individuals, it works well when they agree to stick together, and it doesn't work well when there's one-upmanship. And that really reaches ahead in 1062 for a couple of reasons. There's always been this rift in what we now call Orthodox and Roman Catholic between iconography. So you're probably very well aware that in the East, the Orthodox traditions, icons are written, and they're gilded pictures of saints and or the Holy Family and or angels, And those are meant to be contemplative directors of prayer. So no one's ever prayed to an icon. You pray through an icon. They're meant to guide and direct your prayers. And this is still very much the case that if you live in Russia today, it's likely the most valuable thing you own is an icon. And whether you're religious or not, the icon has been passed down for generations, and it lives in a particular corner in your home called the red corner, which is like your most valuable corner. It's like the keeping of tradition, and some of these icons are very precious and lovely, right? Meanwhile, in the West, Roman Catholics have preferred statuaries. So in the East, not so much statuaries. In the West, yes, statuaries. Think of the Pietà, which is in St. Peter's in Rome. By the way, if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's a lovely statuary. So they've got that difference. There's also a difference in dress. So in the Orthodox traditions, and this has been true since Constantine moved over, before he moved over, in the Eastern traditions, people dressed in like all black with the black veil. The patriarchs still dress like that to this day. They don't wear the chasuble. They don't wear what Romans wear. And that's because they dressed in the Eastern style, not the Western style, right? So that's looked a little different. There's also been a little bit of difference between understanding and place of the Holy Spirit in both traditions. The real rub, though, happens over this one little phrase in the Nicene Creed. So prior to the year 1062, they said, "We believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father." Period. So the Pope in 1062 decided to show off that he was, in fact, the most powerful leader in the Christian world by adding this phrase called the Filioque, which means "and the Son." The Pope did that singularly, did not call an ecumenical council, because he was trying to show he could do that without a council. Now, that's a bold move because everything else has been done conciliarly, that is, with a council. So he does that, adds this phrase to the creed that's supposed to go through all Christendom, whereas the patriarch is like, "No, I don't believe in that. We're not doing that." The Pope says, "Well, you will do it because I'm the Pope." And the patriarch says, "You're excommunicated." So that creates this divide. And now for the first time, there's a Roman Catholic Church and an Eastern Orthodox Church. Where do the names come from? Orthodox, right, means proper glory or right glory. They chose that name for themselves. The Roman Catholics called them the Eastern heretics. Catholic means universal, has always meant universal. When we pray for the Catholic Church in the prayers of the people, we're praying for the universal one, like for everybody. So until 1062, when you say Catholic, you really are talking about everybody. But now we use the phrase Roman to differentiate the Roman one from everybody else.
When we visited the Orthodox Church,
The Coptic.
the Coptic Church, they spoke of, I think it was in the 600s or something, that they had split off from Orthodoxy.
Not willingly.
Uh,
The Coptic Orthodox were declared heretics
okay.
because they're monophysites.
Uh,
They believe Jesus has one nature, not two. So you can see this when the Pope blesses people, the Pope uses this motion for the two natures of Jesus, the Trinity, which is 3 in 1, and the 5 wounds of Jesus. Like this is all like a thing. And those wounds, that sounds silly. Like everybody believes he's got 5 wounds. He can only have 5 wounds if he has a physical body. So this is physicality, and he's got 2 natures, fully human, fully divine. And there's a Trinity, which is why there's a Unitarian church, because there's no Trinity if you're Unitarian. So that gesture is doing a lot of Christian Orthodox thinking in one hand.
So the Coptic Church does not believe in both natures.
No, they're monophysites. Now, if you ask them that, they'd say, "Of course we do," but they don't. Or that's what we decided. The Ethiopic Church is also a monophysite church as well. one nature of Jesus. See, we have this weird paradox, right? Jesus is fully human, like 100%, and he's 100% divine. Well, what's the sense of that? It's a holy mystery. But it's very mysterious, right? And so much so, right, that if you ask the average person, hey, like, Jesus went around and when he met you, he just read your whole mind and knew you completely, right? Because he's God, like he can do that. But you can't do that and be a full human being because like we can't do that. So how do you figure like God is fully present in a body that's got limits, like that bleeds and gets acne and ingrown hairs? Like we're still puzzling over that.
Yeah, just my own thinking. It just makes more sense to me. And this is probably very, very typical. I believe he's human, then becomes divine.
Well, and so that is there is a position, right, called adoptionism, that Jesus is like the best person in the world. And so God's like, I'll work with that one. And then God fully is present in Jesus. But then before the cross, God's like, I'm getting out of here and leaves. Just so you know, like that's an early Christian controversy. It's called adoptionism. Because then God doesn't have to die or suffer. Because like, how could God die or suffer? Like God's all powerful. That doesn't, and that particular idea that God doesn't suffer was ruled heretical. So there's a lot of flavors of this. By the way, I'm not the arbiter of what's heretical or not. I'm just telling you historical doctrines. We all have to come up with some understanding of how can you be both at the same time? Like, what does that mean, and how does that even work? But that's a little bit at play in some of these splits that aren't just religious, but they involve territory and real people, which means they involve items, and then they start to involve, well, armies all of a sudden. I mean, this is really bad precedent. This and this, these are bad things, but you can see that they kind of go together because once you'll go overseas, well, what's stopping you at home? And then what's stopping you from your neighbor who may not be the right idea?
Did the sack of Constantinople during the Crusades have anything to do with the split?
They may have already, well, keep in mind, they'd already split before Constantinople gets sacked. The split happens now, and maybe if you're a Western Christian, you're under the Roman Catholic banner. Well, what do you mean you won't let me in? I'm your Christian brother. Oh, it's because you're one of those. So I'm entitled because you're heretical to rob you. That's all it was. It was just a smash and grab job, right? So this is where we're going. I mean, and honestly, right, when Constantine says there's one faith and you have to follow it, people flee. So this is the first time that your beliefs, the Nicene Creed, it's the first time where your beliefs can put you in physical jeopardy from fellow Christians. That kind of goes away a little bit with Patrick, but it comes back, particularly here in the 11th century, with the Crusades and the Albigensians and with the schism between East and West, which we still are in, right? We're still split between the Orthodox traditions and the Roman Catholic traditions. Turns out, you probably know this, over the next 300 or 400 years, the East is going to increasingly fail, mainly because the Muslim empire is going to once again get rekindled and do well. And there's really nobody who cares about Rome, so it's kind of safe from invasion and intruders, and it's going to grow in power and influence again. Right? I mean, initially Rome fell, East went mile high, and then slow deterioration, slow growth. And this is the point where maybe they're even, but now Rome's going to go up and political power of Constantinople is going to go down.
What happens with the patriarch when they're taken over by Islam.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. Muslims, like, they don't like wholesale kill everybody in the city. If you're Jewish or Christian, you can stay if you pay the tax. Like, that's the Muslim policy, that's been the Muslim policy. Like, now look, if you're Zoroastrian or you're Wiccan, like, we're going to kill you, right? But they have an understanding, we'll talk about this when we study Islam, that people of the book, Christians, Jews, and Muslims, we do have this common root in Abraham and in like recorded revelation. Ultimately, what Muslims decide is that the Jewish scriptures are corrupted and the Christian scriptures are corrupted. By the way, they're not entirely wrong, because we don't have the original documents. And hey, we do have manuscript traditions where like variants abound. I don't mean like there's a lot of them, but like there's variations in manuscripts. So I think it's very fair to say there's some corrupted tradition.
I remember when I was working in Saudi Arabia, we had to pay that zakat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so that you can be tolerated.
Yeah.
Right now, if you'd become Muslim, you would not have had to pay that tax. You would have paid this is a tax above taxation, right? So look, this would be like if you live in the city of Nassau Bay, you pay your property taxes, but then you get a special bill for being like a Christian in Nassau Bay. I don't know how much it is, but it's something extra, right? Where you have to pay us to put up with you. Yeah. And that takes us like to the 1200s. And sure enough, there's this really famous guy, maybe you know him, Thomas, St. Thomas Aquinas, who is probably brilliant. I mean, probably brilliant, who writes a library. I mean, the writings of Thomas Aquinas are like that long, super influential thinker. And he gives his Catholic Church, and he is Roman. He gives the Roman Church like a really big gift. He essentially systematizes theology. Instead of it being local, he's written like the definitive encyclopedia on what it means to be a Roman Catholic and what you're supposed to do and think, including how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Like, he really thought about that. Not because he was silly, because he thought everything fit together in an encyclopedia of systematic theology. Like, he thought that. So there was no question that was too urbane or nuts for Thomas. Like, every question had to have an answer because God was in control of everything. So Thomas does a lot of writing.
What was he in the church?
He's a priest.
He was a priest.
He's a priest and highly educated, right? And
I would imagine.
and thoughtful. I mean, really, like, I don't like a lot of his theology, but like, it's not because he was dumb. It's just because I don't agree, but like, he wasn't trying to like, I don't think he wasn't trying to like dominate people, or I think he was just trying to make sense of the whole world. Like Voltaire, right? With the Encyclopedia Project. It's just, his was just inside of the church.
This is absolutely fascinating. I just really.
Oh, well, and I'm
Okay.
skipping a lot, right? Keep in mind, I'm
Yeah.
skipping a lot, right? I'm not gonna go all the way up to the Reformation, and I know I'm gonna get the kind of sequence a little bit, but you probably all know that in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. You probably also may not know that in 1492 is when the Jews were driven out of Spain.
Yes.
So just to put in perspective, right, we're now 450 years after the First Crusade, and we're still doing that stuff. They didn't do it by themselves. Ferdinand and Isabella, they didn't drive the Jews out of Spain by themselves. They had help from the Roman Catholic Church, who sent the Second Inquisition. Right, Second Inquisition. And the Inquisition was concerned with remaining Muslims, but also Jews who have always been tolerated by Muslims, like to this day. Not so much. By the way, the conflict in Israel is not a conflict between Muslims and Jews. It's not. It's a conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, because those are different things. So just make sure that I'm really clear about that. Palestinians don't hate Israel because they're Jews. They hate them because they're Israelis. Yeah, anyway, so this is when there became a major drive, and this is where, you know, the stories of the Spanish Inquisition are legendary for their horror, honestly. But we're still seeing this play out. Okay, Crusades are going on, and then there's also this thing called the 100 Years' War. You've probably heard of. This is a war between England and Spain. It sort of kicks off in 1066 with the Battle of Hastings. So there's a schism, there's a crusade. Now France, I mean, they're both fighting in the crusade for like the church, but now England and France are at war with each other, right? So there's the Norman conquest of England, 1066, and then there's going to be the 100 Years' War, which is in the 1200s. So the Normans they conquer England, right? And that's why in English, there's these interesting dual words. We don't realize that there's lamb and there's mutton.
Yeah.
And this has to do with French getting into English because only French people could eat the lamb, the mutton, and English people raised the lamb. Something like this. I used to be really sharp on it, and I'm not anymore. But if you ever wonder why there's like two different words for the same thing, it goes back to, for animals, it goes back to the 100 Years' War, because the Normans ate the good food and the peasants raised it and weren't allowed to eat it.
Was it really 100 years?
Not literally, it was like 85. I mean, it was a long,
But it was a
long
time.
battle. And by the way, the Norman conquest, 1066, right? That doesn't take 100 years. The 100 Years' War starts in the 1200s, when now the English have retaken their own land, and well, they'd like to repay their French lords by taking France back, right? And if you're curious, we have this particular gesture that you see in traffic when someone's perceived you've done a mistake. That actually comes from the 100 Years' War. It's based on this gesture. The real advance was that the English developed the longbow, and the longbow was a heck of a thing to pull back. I mean, it was really hard, but if you could draw a longbow, it would penetrate French armor. So this was the thing, that the Normans had this armor that was impregnable by English archers, and so they just kind of rode over them. But then the English figured out you could make this longbow and you could kill French knights where they stood. So it became the practice, if a French person captured an English soldier, they'd cut their bow fingers off so that they couldn't pull the longbow. So the English sort of reply to the French is, got my fingers, right? So that's where, and it's apparently historically true. You can't pull a longbow with just one. You have to have both. Like you really do have to have both, because you're pulling like 100 pounds of stress back without wheels, right? There's no compound to it. So you're having to hold that the whole time. So early variants may have just been the middle. It may have been both. But again, you can't pull the longbow without your middle finger. So this is why we use the middle finger today from the 100 Years' War. The English actually do really well in the 100 Years' War. I mean, they really are they take Paris, right? They have taken the city of Rheims. It's just like weird European lore. Rheims is this city in France, and if you want to be crowned the king of France, it has to happen in Rheims. You can't be crowned king in Paris, even though that's your capital. You have to go to Rheims. So when Joan of Arc comes around, there's this kind of crown prince. The French word for that is the Dauphin, and the Dauphin can't become the king unless he gets to Rheims. But Rheims is controlled by English people. So there's Joan, who is like, we'd probably call Joan of Arc like somebody with a mental illness today. We probably would call her like somebody who, I don't know, maybe is like hallucinates. Maybe she has seizures. We might consider her somebody who has borderline personality disorder or who's bipolar. But at the time, she was considered like a holy person because she talked directly with God. And God told her, like, hey, like I want the Dauphin to be king, and France should be France. It shouldn't be England. So Joan rallied some losing forces. I mean, really, the French were probably going to lose, but Joan gave them like this vision that God gave her that they were going to beat the English, and soldiers actually followed her. She won battles. She found the magic sword of Charles Martel. They took Rheims back. The Dauphin became king, and then perhaps the Dauphin sort of gave Joan to the English, and they burned her at the stake. Hard to say. Like, didn't directly hand her over, but didn't support her in the siege of Paris, where kind of Joan was trying to take Paris when she was outnumbered like 5-1. It's like very, very odd, this story. So nobody's right. Seems to be really clear whether the Dauphin used her and was ready to be done with her, because she was crazy, right? Like, she talked to God. I mean, that's tough.
She had to pick him out of a group of people.
And she did.
Yes.
She did a lot of interesting things. I mean, it's interesting. Like, what's the difference between being crazy and being holy? We struggle with it, really. I'm not convinced that a lot of, like, I don't know that Francis would have passed a personality test. I don't think so. Or Claire, or Bernard of Clairvaux. Like, I don't know, right? But because they weren't subject to that in those days, right? Like, okay, like maybe you do have a vision that's compelling, right? That only matters, right? Because the 100 Years' War definitively makes France and England separate now, right? And the thing that follows is going to be the War of Succession in England, called the War of the Roses, right? And that's between two houses, the Lancasters and the Yorks. If you watch the Game of Thrones, this is where he got the idea, because it's the Lannisters, which sounds a lot like Lancaster, and the Starks, which are meant to be the Yorks. Anyway, so those two houses fight it out, and they exhaust each other so completely that Henry Tudor is able to come in as kind of like the sleeper and take the country over, right? So the Tudors win the War of the Roses that they didn't fight it. I mean, that's very interesting to consider. That's what sets in motion the Church of England. Meanwhile, France consolidates. They do stay very much a Catholic country, very, very Catholic, aided because after the 100 Years' War, one of the popes decides that the capital of the church shouldn't be in Rome, it should be in Avignon. If that sounds French, it's because it's in France. And so the Pope moves from Rome to Avignon, which Martin Luther calls the Babylonian captivity. And so that's probably the stopping point for today. And we will pick up with how we get to the Reformation next time. And frankly, how we get to the Reformation is why we have so many denominations.
I've forgotten about the Avignon being the place. I've forgotten about that.
Very odd, isn't it odd?
It is.
You're the Bishop of Rome and you went to Avignon. Like,
Yeah.
that's odd.
We were there, and that was the history of it.
Yeah, along with there being 3 popes at the same time. So I'll tell you that story. I'll tell you that story next time.